when my daughter said, "Go live in a nursing home." There were no screams, no tears, no pleas. Only silence. A dense, heavy silence that fell between us like a broken object on the living room floor. I was sitting on the edge of the sofa, my hands in my lap, feeling the rough fabric of the old skirt I was wearing that day. The room was beautiful, modern, too tidy to feel like a home. My son-in-law had chosen everything. The colors, the furniture, even the arrangement of the chairs. Nothing reminded me of the house where I raised my daughter. Nothing reminded me of who I was. She said the sentence as if she were reading from a shopping list. Without hesitation. Without looking me in the eye. She simply let it go, crossed her arms, and sighed, as if weary of a burden that had lasted too long. I felt something stir inside me, but I didn't let it out. I learned early on that you have to keep your pain bottled up to survive. My son-in-law, sitting in the leather armchair, watched everything intently. He waited for a reaction. He waited for despair. He waited for me to beg. His eyes reflected that clearly. I said nothing. I simply took a deep breath and kept my gaze fixed. It was then that I noticed the first sign of discomfort in him. The silence wasn't scripted. They had planned this conversation. I knew it. My daughter's rehearsed tone gave it away. The son-in-law leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, as if preparing for a confrontation. But there was no confrontation. There was only a woman too tired to talk about her own dignity. I've been retired for 6 years. I worked my whole life as a seamstress, sewing clothes and clinging to dreams that were never really mine. I raised my daughter alone after being widowed too young. I gave up so much so she could study, have comfort, and believe she could achieve more. When she got married, I thought I was gaining a child. In reality, I was handing over my story to a stranger who never saw me as a person, only as an obstacle. "Didn't you hear?" my daughter insisted, her voice now a little irritated. "I told you a nursing home is best for you." I heard it. I heard every syllable. They echoed in my head, mingled with old memories of holding her, fever, sleepless nights. Still, I didn't answer. I simply looked up and met her gaze, trying to recognize the little girl who had once proudly called me mother. I couldn't find her. My son-in-law cleared his throat. "It's a rational decision," he said, with that tone of someone who thinks he owns the truth and everyone else. "You can't live alone anymore." That hurt me more than the comment about the nursing home. Not because it was true, but because he never bothered to get to know me. I was invisible. I always had been. I was only useful when it suited him. As they spoke, I noticed small details. The expensive watch on his wrist. My daughter's immaculate nails. The chill of the air conditioning. Everything screamed that I no longer belonged there. Yet I didn't move. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't ask questions. Silence was my only defense in that moment. And unknowingly, it was also my strength. My daughter got up and started pacing the room. "We've already talked about this," she said, running a hand through her hair. "It's over." Over what? I wanted to ask. Over the love? Over the respect? Over remembering everything I did? But I remained silent. The silence was really starting to bother me. My son-in-law shifted his position, crossed his legs, uncrossed them. Something about him was uneasy. They expected tears. They expected guilt. They expected submission. I offered them calm, and that disarmed them. I felt my heart pounding, but my face remained serene. The years of life teach things no young person understands. One of them is that not all battles are won with words. Some are won by observing, waiting, enduring. That's when my son-in-law made his first mistake. He thought my silence was a sign of weakness. "Let's get this over with quickly," he said. "We'll have everything sorted out next week." Everything. My life summed up in a single word. In that moment, something inside me stirred. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. A quiet certainty that this story wasn't over yet. I stood up slowly. I grabbed my purse. I looked one last time around the room, at my daughter, at the man who thought he had everything under control. "It's okay," I said for the first time. Just that. No pleading. No explanations. Their faces changed. My son-in-law smiled, satisfied. My daughter seemed relieved. They didn't notice. The silence wasn't a surrender. It was the beginning of something neither of them was prepared to face. That night, I returned to the room they still called mine, but which no longer felt like home. The walls were too pale, without pictures, without markings, without history. The meticulously made bed seemed more like a warning than a gesture of affection. I sat down slowly and placed my bag on the floor, feeling an old weariness spread through my body. The silence of the hallway contrasted sharply with the noise that still echoed inside me. I didn't cry. I just breathed, trying to understand when that house stopped being my home. When I moved there 3 years earlier, it was presented to me as something temporary. My daughter insisted it would be better for me, that I wouldn't be alone after I retired. I believed her. I sold my small apartment, the one where every wall knew my story, and took only some clothes, photos, and mementos. The rest stayed behind, along with the hope of being closer to her. Back then, the smile was still there. The hugs were still there. But everything changed too quickly. At first, my son-in-law was polite, almost solicitous. He asked if I needed anything, complimented my cooking, and commented on my organization. Gradually, his tone changed. The observations, disguised as concern, began. "You're getting forgetful. Perhaps it's best not to get involved. Let me handle it." Each phrase seemed insignificant, but together they formed an invisible wall around me. Without realizing it, I stopped offering my opinion. I simply accepted it. My daughter began repeating everything he said. The words ceased to be her own. They became echoes. If I disagreed, she sighed wearily. If I questioned her, she said I was exaggerating. I learned to stay silent to avoid conflict. That's how I lost ground. First in conversations, then in decisions, finally in my own home. That night it became clear that the plan had been hatched long ago. Lying in bed, I remembered the day my son-in-law asked me to organize my documents. He said it was to make things easier if something happened. I trusted him. I always trusted him too much. I put everything in a folder I never saw again. Cards, papers, contracts. When I asked him about it, he said everything was safe. Safe for whom? The question stuck in my throat. Trust, I realized too late, had become just another tool for control. The next morning, I woke up early, as usual. I made coffee and sat alone at the table. My daughter rushed out, talking on her phone. She barely glanced at me. My son-in-law came by, took the cup, and thanked me without emotion. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. There was something different in the air. A disquieting certainty that I was living my last days there. Not by my own choice, but because someone had decided they no longer needed me. After lunch, I heard my son-in-law talking quietly on the phone in his office. I hadn't intended to listen, but the door was ajar. He was talking about visits, prices, available spaces. My heart sank. The nursing home was no longer just a threat. It was a plan. I closed my eyes for a moment, leaning against the wall with my hand for balance. Even so, I remained silent. Something inside me told me that reacting now would be falling into the trap. That afternoon, my daughter came into the room without knocking. "Start packing," she said, avoiding my gaze. "It's better to get ahead." That hurt more than any shouting. I nodded, too calm for someone being discarded. She left quickly, as if my presence bothered her. I stared at the nearly empty closet. How many lives can fit into a few drawers? How many years can be reduced to small suitcases? As I folded my laundry, I remembered every sacrifice she made. The times I went without so she wouldn't lack anything. The advice she gave me, the sleepless nights. None of that seemed to exist now. Love had been replaced by convenience. Even so, I didn't feel hatred. I felt sadness. A deep, yet clear-headed sadness. It was then that I understood something essential. I needed to observe more and speak less. That night, during dinner, my son-in-law announced that they would be visiting the nursing home on Saturday. He said it casually, as if he were just going out. My daughter agreed. I continued eating slowly. He watched me, alert to any reaction. I showed none. I simply thanked him for the meal, and stood up. As I rose from the table, I noticed he was still watching me suspiciously. My silence no longer seemed so comfortable to him. In the bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. Something was wrong. There was too much haste. Too much certainty. As if he were sure nothing could go wrong. It was there, in that stillness, that I sensed the danger lurking behind his overconfidence. My son-in-law was rushing. And without realizing it, he was buying me time. Time to remember. Time to see. Time to understand that, before leaving that house, I needed to discover exactly what he thought he had under control. The following days passed slowly, as if time itself had decided to observe me. Every movement within that house seemed calculated, rehearsed, designed to remind me that I no longer belonged there. My son-in-law had definitively assumed the role of administrator of my existence. He spoke to me as if I were a confused child, incapable of understanding her own life. And my daughter, sitting beside him, nodded silently, as if that man knew more about me than I did myself. On Thursday, she entered the room with a folder in her hand. She didn't knock. She simply opened the door and smiled with that exaggerated politeness. "I came to help," she said. The word help resonated within me with a bitter taste. She sat down in the chair and began taking documents out of the folder. I recognized some. Others I didn't. She talked as she showed them to me, explaining things I had never asked her to understand. Benefits, values, deadlines. All presented as if it were a favor. "This makes things easier for you," he explained. "We'll take care of everything." I nodded, looking at the papers, trying to maintain a neutral expression. He didn't notice, but in that moment I understood that this folder wasn't just about organization. It was about power. Each document represented a decision that was no longer mine. Each signature it mentioned was a step further away from my own life. When I asked him about some documents I didn't recognize, he answered too quickly. "That's already been taken care of." Taken care of by whom? I didn't press the issue. Silence became my only option again. But inside, something began to realign. I wasn't forgetful, as he implied. My memory was intact. And something didn't add up with the story he'd told me so convincingly. That same day, my daughter took me to the doctor. She said it was just a routine checkup. In the examination room, she did most of the talking. She interrupted me, finished my sentences, and exaggerated minor difficulties. I felt invisible. The doctor looked at her, not at me. In the end, he recommended closer monitoring. My daughter thanked him, pleased. In the car, she smiled, saying that everything would be easier now. For whom? I wondered. The humiliations didn't come in the form of shouts. They came disguised as affection, as concern, as help. And that hurt even more, because it prevented me from complaining without seeming ungrateful. If I reacted, they would see me as stubborn. If I remained silent, as weak. I chose silence again, but this time with my eyes wide open. On Saturday we visited the nursing home. A clean and tidy building, too quiet. Smiling staff, well-lit hallways, the smell of disinfectant. Everything seemed fine. Ideal. My daughter praised it, my son-in-law asked technical questions. I walked behind, observing the elderly residents sitting in chairs, their eyes vacant. Some seemed resigned. Others lost. I felt a tightness in my chest. This wasn't care. This was waiting. In one of the rooms, a woman took my hand for a moment. Her gaze was tired but attentive. She said nothing. She simply squeezed my fingers and let go. It was quick but enough. I left there convinced that this wasn't my place. Not yet. Maybe never. My son-in-law noticed my discomfort and remarked, lightly, that it was all a matter of adapting. The word adapting sounded like giving up. Back home, she called someone and discussed dates. She was finalizing details. I wasn't invited to the conversations anymore. I was only informed. That night, during dinner, my daughter mentioned that I should sell some things I still had stored away. "So I don't accumulate," she said. She didn't ask any questions. She just advised me. The humiliation now came with a forced distancing. It was as if they were erasing my trace. In my room, I opened a box where I kept old photographs. My daughter as a child, me as a young woman. A whole life captured on yellowed paper. No one could take that away from me. Not yet. Flipping through them, I remembered a forgotten detail. The day I signed the purchase agreement for my old apartment. My son-in-law wasn't there. Neither was my daughter. I signed directly with the real estate agent. The money went into my account. I remembered it clearly. So why weeks later did he start managing my finances? The question kept hammering in my head. That night, I barely slept. The silence was no longer just protection. It was strategy. I needed to remember, to piece things back together, to understand exactly when I had relinquished so much power. And above all, if there was still something they didn't know. Something that could change the course of that story. The next morning, I found my son-in-law in his office, reviewing papers. He looked at me in surprise. "Do you need something?" he asked overly politely. "I just wanted to understand one thing," I replied calmly. He shifted in his chair, attentive. "Who authorized the change to my account?" His smile vanished for a second. It was quick, almost imperceptible. But I saw it. For the first time, I saw him lose control. He gave a vague answer, spoke of pragmatism, of trust. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I thanked him and left. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. That man had gone too far. And the more recklessly he went, the deeper the trail he left. For the first time since I heard the word asylum, I felt something more than pain. I felt that this injustice had gone too far to end like this. And without knowing it, my son-in-law was digging his own grave. That afternoon, after the conversation at the office, something shifted inside me. It wasn't sudden anger or fury. It was lucidity. A serene clarity that only comes when you understand you've already lost everything. I walked purposefully to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed, taking deep breaths. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I felt alert. I began mentally reviewing every event of the past few years. The interrupted conversations. Other people's decisions. The signatures I didn't remember giving. The money that seemed to have evaporated without a clear explanation. All of it formed a picture I had avoided seeing. Not out of naivete, but out of love. Loving too blindly. And I had loved my daughter more than myself. I got up and went to the suitcase where I kept the few things that were still mine. At the bottom, inside a yellowed envelope, I found something I hadn't seen in a long time. An old receipt, carefully folded. It was a bank statement from the day I sold my apartment. My name was there. My account number. My value. I clearly remembered keeping it instinctively, like someone who senses that one day they might need to prove something. At the time, I didn't understand why. Now it all made sense. I sat down again and read every line carefully. The money had gone into my personal account, not a joint one. I was sure of it. And yet, months later, my son-in-law started managing everything as if it were his own. Something was wrong. Very wrong. My heart raced, but I kept calm. That piece of paper was more than just proof. It was an anchor. A concrete reminder that I still existed legally, not just as an emotional burden. That night, during dinner, I observed my son-in-law with different eyes. He spoke with confidence, discussing investments as if he were an expert. My daughter admired him. I simply listened. At one point, he mentioned the move date again. "Everything is going well," he said, looking at me with superiority. I nodded. But inside, something was quietly smiling. He didn't know what I knew. After dinner, my daughter approached me in the hallway. "Are you okay?" she asked, without conviction. I replied that I was. She seemed too relieved. That confirmed my suspicions. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about making the process easier. The less resistance, the better. They were blindly fending me off like an old piece of furniture. And furniture doesn't question anything. The next day, I woke up early and decided to do something different. I asked permission to use the office computer. I said I wanted to look for some old photos. My son-in-law hesitated for a second, but agreed. I sat down at the desk he considered his exclusive territory. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I opened the browser and went to the bank's website. He watched me from a distance, feigning disinterest. As I entered my information, I felt a chill run down my spine. The account still existed. It wasn't empty as I feared, but it wasn't untouched either. There were transactions I didn't recognize, transfers, investments, decisions I hadn't made. That confirmed everything. My son-in-law wasn't just in control. He was acting without my explicit authorization. I swallowed hard. It wasn't just an injustice. It was something much worse. I calmly closed the page and thanked him for the computer. He didn't ask anything, but his gaze was too attentive. Suspicious. For the first time, I realized that my silence no longer made him comfortable. Something had changed in the dynamic. I sensed it. He did too. In the afternoon, he rushed out to attend to pending matters. My daughter stayed home restless. She avoided looking at me. At the end of the day, I received an unexpected call. It was an old friend who worked as an assistant in an accounting office. We didn't talk much, but we always remained respectful. She knew about the sale of my apartment at that time. Casually, she mentioned that she remembered the paperwork well. That gave me courage. I asked her if she still had access to some records. She said yes. And that might help me understand things better. I hung up, my heart racing. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking truth, justice, dignity. For the first time since I'd heard the word asylum, I felt real hope. Not that naive hope, but the kind that comes from information, from understanding, from preparation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I was being manipulated. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the dark ceiling and made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't leave that house like an abandoned burden. I wouldn't leave defeated. If I had to leave, it would be with my head held high, with clarity, with the truth. My son-in-law believed he had absolute control. My daughter believed in the most convenient version of the story. Neither of them imagined that, silently, I had found the first piece capable of changing everything. I fell asleep with a strange, almost serene feeling. The pain was still there, but now it shared space with something new, awareness. And when a woman regains awareness of her own worth, no one can take her away so easily. That had been the first turning point. And without realizing it, I had been given exactly what I needed. Time to wake up. The days that followed that discovery were the longest of my life. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything seemed too heavy to bear alone. I woke up to the same ceiling, the same silence in the hallways, the same conversations interrupted as I entered a room. But now I saw what I had previously pretended not to see. Every gesture, every word, every decision made without me carried a different weight. The pain had changed shape. It was no longer confusing. It was clear, and therefore harder to bear. On Tuesday, my daughter announced they would be receiving visitors on Sunday. She said this while fiddling with her phone without looking up. Some friends of my husband's from work, she explained. It's important. For whom? I wondered. She didn't ask if I was comfortable with it. She didn't ask if I wanted to participate. She simply informed me. My son-in-law nodded, satisfied. At that moment, I felt something was off. There was a hidden agenda behind this meeting. I spent the following days in silence, observing. My son-in-law talked more on the phone, always in a low voice, always far from me. My daughter seemed nervous, rehearsing her lines in front of the mirror, as if she were preparing for a performance. I remained calm. I protected my discoveries as one protects something fragile. I knew it wasn't the right time yet. But the pain grew, accumulated, on the verge of overflowing. On Sunday the house was different. Flowers on the table, a delicious meal, rehearsed laughter. I sat in a corner of the living room, dressed simply as always. The guests arrived full of compliments. They commented on the house, my son-in-law's success, the comfortable life they led. No one introduced me. No one said who I was. I was just a silent presence in the background. At one point, I overheard my son-in-law telling a story about family responsibilities. He spoke loudly, confidently, as if he were at an important meeting. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions, he said, glancing at me sideways. Think about what's best for everyone. A few people nodded sympathetically. My daughter added, my mother understands. She knows it's for her own good. I felt my face burn. It wasn't just a decision. It was exposure. Public humiliation, disguised as concern. Someone asked me directly. And you, ma'am? A woman said, smiling. Do you like living here? Before I could answer, my daughter came running in. It's temporary, she said. We're looking for a better place for her. A nursing home wasn't mentioned, but it was implied. The weight of those words hit me like a silent blow. Temporary. An object kept until it's discarded. I could have spoken. I could have explained. I could have told everything. But I didn't. Not yet. I simply smiled politely and looked down. Inside something broke. It wasn't pride. It was trust. In that instant, I understood that my daughter had crossed a line I could perhaps no longer ignore. The pain reached another level. It was no longer just mine. It had become public. After the guests left, the house fell silent again. My daughter seemed relieved. My son-in-law satisfied. He approached me in the kitchen and said casually, "See how everyone agrees?" That was too much. I didn't reply. I washed the cup slowly, trying to control the trembling of my hands. He smiled, convinced he had won. He didn't realize that that night he had sown the seeds of something irreversible. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and for the first time since it all began, I cried. I cried softly, so as not to be heard. I cried for the little girl I raised, for the woman I became, for my wounded dignity in front of strangers. The pain had reached its limit, but along with it, a silent resolve was born. I would no longer allow that humiliation. The next morning, I woke up with puffy eyes, but a clear mind. I grabbed my bag and said I was going out to take care of something. My son-in-law asked what it was. I simply replied that I needed to walk. He didn't press the issue. Perhaps he thought I was too weak to make any significant movement. He was wrong. I went straight to the place where I was meeting my old friend from accounting. She greeted me attentively, listening to everything without interrupting. I showed him the documents, told him the facts, spoke to him about the exposure, the monitoring, the asylum. He frowned. "This isn't right," he said firmly. Those words brought me relief. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't imagining anything. There was something concrete there. Something that needed to be addressed seriously. I left with clear instructions and a knot in my stomach. The truth was beginning to take shape. When I got home, I found my daughter sitting in the living room. She looked at me differently, suspiciously. "Where did you go?" she asked. Calmly, I replied that I had already taken care of some things. She didn't like the answer. For the first time, I felt that my silence no longer reassured her. I was starting to lose control. And that scared her. That night, lying in bed, I realized that something had definitely changed. The pain was still there, strong, present. But now it came with something bigger. A line had been crossed. And when pain reaches that point, it stops paralyzing me. It pushes. It pushes forward, even when the path is terrifying. I knew that nothing would be easy from then on. But I also knew that I wouldn't go back. The next step was already being prepared. And they still had no idea what was coming. After that Sunday, I was no longer the same woman who used to wander the halls of that house in automatic silence. Something had rearranged itself inside me, like old furniture being put back in its place. The pain was still there, alive, throbbing, but it no longer controlled me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't wake up just to get through the day. I woke up to observe, to reflect, and to prepare myself. I started waking up even earlier. Before the house awoke, I would sit at the kitchen table with a simple cup of coffee and stay there, silent, organizing my thoughts. I began writing everything down in an old notebook I found at the bottom of my bag. Dates, phrases spoken, decisions made without my consent. Each word written seemed to return a piece of my voice to me. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking clarity. And clarity brings a quiet strength that no one perceives at first. I also started praying again. Not those hurried, habitual prayers, but sincere, almost whispered conversations. I spoke to God as one speaks to an old friend, sharing fears, asking for discernment. I didn't ask for punishment for anyone. I asked for protection for myself. I asked for wisdom not to act impulsively. Something inside me told me that haste would be my enemy. I needed to walk with firmness, not anger. My daughter noticed the change before her son-in-law. Perhaps because she knew me better. She began to observe me more, to ask me veiled questions. "You're different," she told me one morning. I simply replied that I was tired of feeling bad inside. She didn't press the issue, but her eyes betrayed her unease. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for making them uncomfortable. I had spent years feeling uncomfortable just to reassure them. My son-in-law, for his part, remained calm. He continued talking about dates, deadlines, and future decisions. But now there was something new in his behavior. Constant vigilance. He asked me where I was going, who I was talking to, what I was doing during the day. I always answered politely, but without going into details. The less I said, the more impatient he became. It was curious to see how control depends on the other person's ignorance. When that ignorance ends, control begins to fail. One quiet afternoon, I sat in the small backyard of the house, under the shade of a neglected tree. I took my notebook and stayed there, writing down memories of my life before all this. The achievements, the losses, the decisions made with love. I remembered the woman who faced real hardship, who raised a daughter alone, who worked until her fingers ached. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had simply remained silent for too long. As I wrote, I realized something important. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to those who had already decided not to see it. It was useless. Worth isn't proven. It's recognized. And in that moment I began to recognize myself again. This understanding brought me a strange, almost unsettling, but necessary peace. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just needed to stop letting them erase me. That week, I received another call from my friend in accounting. She had reviewed the records more closely and confirmed my suspicions. Financial decisions had been made without my formal authorization. Nothing obvious at first glance, but enough to raise serious concerns. Hearing that sent chills down my spine, but it also confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. Reality, however harsh, was now on my side. I hung up the phone and sat for a few minutes, breathing deeply. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I simply accepted it. This information wasn't a weapon, but a responsibility. I had to act with caution. I knew that any misstep could be used against me. So I decided to keep observing, to remain silent. But now a conscious and strategic silence, different from that wounded silence of the beginning. My daughter began to distance herself emotionally. She spoke to me less, avoided long conversations. Sometimes, I caught her staring at me from afar, as if trying to understand who I had become. I watched her too. I saw in her not only coldness, but confusion. She had allowed someone else to take control of everything, even decisions involving her own mother. And now perhaps she was beginning to understand the weight of that. One night, while I was tidying the kitchen, I overheard my son-in-law impatiently saying that I was behaving strangely. He said I should be careful. That didn't scare me. On the contrary, it seemed like confirmation that I was on the right track. When the person in control starts to feel threatened, it's because something has changed. And it had. Something inside me no longer accepted submission as a means of survival. Before falling asleep, I sat on the bed and reread everything I had written in my notebook. Each page told a story I had lived and almost forgotten. I closed my eyes and felt a quiet gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the transformation it was causing. I still didn't know how it would all end. I didn't know what consequences I would face. But one thing I was absolutely certain of. I was no longer the woman who heard the word asylum and remained silent out of fear. That night, I said one last prayer. I asked for strength to stand firm. I asked that the truth would prevail, without hatred, without shouting, without scandal. I asked for courage to face the consequences of the decisions I would make. As I turned off the light, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. Not in others. In myself. And when a woman regains her self-confidence, nothing around her stays the same for long. The change began almost imperceptibly, like everything truly important. There was no announcement, no direct confrontation. Just subtle signs that my son-in-law's control was no longer as firm as he thought. I maintained my trust in his words, but his body betrayed him. He walked faster, talked too much, repeated explanations no one asked for. Overconfidence had turned into anxiety, and I observed it all with the calm of someone who finally sees the whole picture. That week, my daughter came home earlier than usual. She threw her bag on the sofa and sat down, tired. running her hands over her face. Something had happened. I was in the kitchen making tea when she came in and looked at me the way she hadn't looked at me in a long time. There was doubt in that look. Not harshness, not contempt. Doubt. That moved me more than any apology. "Mom," she began but stopped. I waited. I didn't press her. Silence, once again, did the work for me. "Did you know that some things about money weren't the way I thought?" she asked softly. My heart raced, but I remained calm. I simply replied that there were things I was beginning to understand, too. Nothing more. She frowned. The seed had been planted. That night, I heard an argument coming from his room. It wasn't typical. My son-in-law always liked to keep up appearances, even at home. The voices were subdued, but tense. Words like, "You shouldn't have touched that," and "You told me everything was fine," carried to the hallway. I sat on the bed and closed my eyes. I didn't feel joy. I felt a strange weight. The truth, when it begins to surface, never comes alone. It brings consequences. The next day, my son-in-law called me in to talk. For the first time, he asked me a question. He didn't order me, he didn't suggest anything. He asked. We sat in the living room, face to face. He tried to maintain a cordial tone, but there was a stiffness in every gesture. He said my daughter was confused, that he needed to reassure her, that everything was under control. Hearing that was almost ironic. Control. The word that had defined my life in recent years now sounded empty. "I just want what's fair," I replied calmly. His eyes widened for a moment. He hadn't expected that word. Fair. I didn't attack. I didn't accuse. I just said that. Silence settled between us again, but now it was different. It wasn't a silence of submission. It was a silence of restrained confrontation. He noticed. He straightened up in his chair, took a deep breath, and ended the conversation quickly. The mask was beginning to crack. That afternoon, my friend in accounting called again. She said she'd found something more concrete. A document showing a transaction made with questionable authorization. It wasn't illegal yet, but it was enough to raise serious concerns. She told me to be careful. I thanked her and hung up with a mixture of fear and relief. My son-in-law's mistake was no longer just a moral one. It was starting to take shape. When my daughter got home from work, she came straight to my room. She closed the door and sat down looking nervous. "I need to ask you something," she said. I nodded. "Did you confide everything in her?" I took a deep breath before answering. I told the truth. That I had trusted her too much. That I never imagined I would have to suspect anything. That I thought I was protecting the family. She lowered her head. Her hands were trembling. For the first time, I saw guilt in her. Real guilt. "He always said you didn't understand these things," she continued. "That it was better this way." I looked at her gently, without accusing her. "And you believed him," I replied. Not as a judgment, but as an observation. She began to cry. A restrained, silent, and deep cry. That cry didn't erase what had happened, but it showed that something inside her was also beginning to change. In the following days, the atmosphere at home changed completely. My son-in-law started arriving later, avoided long conversations, and became easily irritated. My daughter was torn between him and me, as if waking from an uneasy dream. I stood firm, neither provoking nor giving in. The balance of power had shifted. And he sensed it. One morning, I heard my son-in-law on the phone, speaking in a low but agitated voice. He said someone was exaggerating, that there was no problem, that everything had been done for the good of the family. That phrase, repeated so many times, now sounded like a desperate defense. He hung up and realized I was in the hallway. Our eyes met. For the first time, I didn't see superiority. I saw fear. That afternoon, my daughter told me she wanted to review some decisions. She talked about the nursing home, the sale of belongings, how everything had been handled. She didn't apologize. Not yet. But she questioned things. And questioning, in that context, was already a revolution. My son-in-law tried to intervene, to downplay the situation, to regain control. He couldn't. His trust had been shaken. And without his trust, he no longer had the same power. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything that had happened since that cruel phrase uttered from across the room. Go live in a nursing home. I smiled bitterly. He thought that threat would break me. He thought I would beg, that I would cower. Instead, I watched. And as I watched, he moved forward. Every careless step, every arrogant decision, had paved the way for his own downfall. I knew it wasn't the end yet. There would be confrontations, difficult decisions, perhaps losses. But something essential had already happened. The mask had fallen. And when someone is forced to show who they truly are, there's no going back. I closed my eyes with a strange, almost painful, but necessary feeling. The truth had begun to emerge from where it had been hidden. And now nothing could stop it. The house was never the same after the truth began to surface. The hallways seemed narrower, the silence more watchful, as if the walls themselves were listening. My son-in-law avoided being alone with me. When our eyes met, there was haste, stiffness, a clear effort to maintain an image that no longer held up. My daughter, on the other hand, walked as if carrying an invisible weight. She spoke little, thought much. And I remained steadfast, even though my heart was weary. That week, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went out alone, without giving details, without asking permission. I only said I needed to take care of some personal matters. My son-in-law frowned but didn't question it. My daughter simply nodded, lost in her own thoughts. I walked down the street, feeling the sun on my face, breathing in the morning air as if it were new. Each step was a silent reminder that I still had control over my body, my own path. I went to a nearby, simple square with old benches and tall trees. I sat there for a while, watching people pass by, children play, and the elderly chat. I saw reflections of myself there. Ordinary people living, enduring, moving forward. I realized how emotionally isolated I had become in recent years, confined not by walls, but by other people's decisions. That pause was necessary. Not to escape, but to rediscover myself. As I watched, I thought about everything that still needed to be done. The difficult conversations, the painful decisions, the boundaries that would need to be set. Overcoming challenges isn't one big moment. It's a sequence of small, firm decisions, often made alone. I wasn't seeking victory over anyone. I was seeking dignity. And that required constant courage, not just a single act. When I got home, I found my daughter sitting at the table, looking at a stack of papers. She glanced up when she saw me. I've been reading some things, she said hesitantly. Things he was working out. I sat quietly across from her. I didn't celebrate anything, I didn't criticize. I simply listened. She spoke in a confused way, trying to understand things that had always been beyond her grasp. For the first time, there was no defense. Only an attempt at understanding. Why didn't you speak up sooner? She asked, her voice trembling. I took a deep breath before answering. Because I needed time to understand too, I said. And because speaking up sooner wouldn't have changed anything. She lowered her head. That conversation didn't resolve everything, but it opened a door that had been closed for far too long. It wasn't reconciliation yet. It was the beginning of accountability. My son-in-law arrived late that day. Seeing the papers on the table, he tried to take control of the conversation. He spoke loudly, elaborated, and justified every detail. But something had changed. My daughter didn't interrupt to defend him. She didn't automatically agree with his version of events. She simply listened in silence. The same silence that had previously suffocated me now worked in my favor. He sensed it. The tension in the air was almost palpable. That night, I heard an argument even more intense than the last. Doors slammed. Voices rose. I didn't get involved. I stayed in my room, writing in my notebook, noting feelings, not accusations. I knew that confrontation wasn't mine. I had already done my part. The transformation was happening within them. And that's something no one can force. In the following days, I began to organize my things calmly, but with determination. Not to go to a nursing home, but to prepare myself for a dignified exit if necessary. I carefully arranged my belongings, my memories with respect. There was no rush. There was a direction. My daughter noticed. "Are you leaving?" she asked one morning. I looked at her sincerely. "I'm going where there is respect," I replied. That phrase hung in the air, strong and clear. I started taking better care of myself. Light walks, old books, little routines I'd abandoned. Every simple gesture was an act of rebuilding. I didn't need to prove my strength. I needed to live. And living consciously was my greatest response to everything that had happened. My son-in-law watched from a distance, increasingly disoriented. Control was slipping through his fingers like sand. One quiet afternoon, my daughter sat beside me on the sofa. She didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then she simply said, "I was wrong." She didn't apologize. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply acknowledged it. That hurt me and comforted me at the same time. Acknowledging mistakes doesn't erase the past, but it opens the way to something different. I took her hand, not as someone who forgets, but as someone who chooses to move forward with clarity. Overcoming this wasn't a sudden, happy ending. It was a narrow path, full of adjustments, limitations, and conscious decisions. I knew there would still be consequences, final decisions, perhaps even permanent separations. But I also knew that something essential had already been recovered. My voice, my identity, my ability to choose. That night, before falling asleep, I looked out the bedroom window and saw the moon high in the sky. I thought about how many times I had felt small, invisible, disposable. Now even tired, I felt whole. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I was no longer lost in my own story. The path of overcoming adversity didn't return me to who I was before. It led me to someone more aware, more grounded, more complete. And that, I knew, no one could ever take away from me. The following days were filled with a quiet tension, like the air before a storm. Nothing was said aloud, but everything was being decided inside me. I felt it in the way my daughter avoided long conversations, in the way my son-in-law moved around the house with calculated steps, attentive to my every move. The truth, when it begins to surface, no longer hides under the rug. It demands a resolution. And I knew that moment was approaching. One Tuesday morning, my daughter called me to talk. Her voice sounded different, firmer, less defensive. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had so often swallowed my words to maintain a false harmony. This time there was no rush. She took a deep breath before beginning. "I need to get some things straight," she said. She didn't talk about her son-in-law. She talked about herself. That was progress. She explained that she had reviewed documents, spoken with someone she trusted, and asked questions she had never dared to ask before. She spoke of the confusion, of the feeling of having been led astray without realizing it. As she spoke, I listened attentively, without interrupting. It wasn't the time to accuse. It was a time to listen. When she finished, she remained silent, waiting for my reaction. I simply told her that I was relieved she was seeing the reality with her own eyes. Later that day, my son-in-law arrived home and noticed something had changed. The atmosphere was different. My daughter didn't rush to please him, didn't confirm his decisions, or repeat his justifications. She tried to take control of the conversation, but was interrupted. For the first time, she demanded clear explanations. She wouldn't accept vague answers. She wouldn't settle for promises. Her face hardened. Her tone rose. The mask fell completely. I sat there, watching. I didn't need to say anything. Everything I had silently endured was now manifesting itself in his difficulty, sustaining his own narrative. He spoke of intentions, of the family's well-being, of sacrifices. My daughter listened, but she didn't give in. She demanded facts. She demanded clarity. She demanded respect. This man who had always seemed so confident now seemed lost, without the control he thought he possessed. When the argument ended, she stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the hallways, but it didn't frighten me. It was just the sound of something falling apart. My daughter sat back down at the table, dejected. "I don't know what's going to happen now," she said. I honestly replied that I didn't know either. But I knew what I wasn't going to accept anymore. And that was enough to keep me going. That night, I wrote in my notebook for a long time. Not to record injustices, but to organize my decisions. I needed to think clearly about my future, without being subject to its chaos. I considered possibilities, paths, limitations. I thought about where I wanted to live, how I wanted to spend my days. For the first time in a long time, my decisions weren't based on the fear of losing someone, but on respect for myself. In the following days, my son-in-law tried to reconnect with me. He spoke with exaggerated caution, like someone trying to fix something too late. He offered help, suggested adjustments, promised changes. I listened to everything calmly. I didn't argue. I simply made it clear that any decisions from now on would have to be transparent and respectful. He nodded, but there was something empty in his words. Lost control isn't regained with promises. My daughter, in turn, began to take on small responsibilities that I had previously delegated entirely. She scheduled meetings, made calls, and made decisions without asking permission. I watched her closely, not with blind pride, but with cautious hope. True change takes time. It requires consistency. I was willing to wait, but not to back down. On a quiet afternoon, I sat down again in the square where I had been days before. I took my notebook and reflected. The outcome was approaching, but it didn't have to be explosive. Sometimes, justice doesn't translate into punishment, but into a repositioning. Each person occupies the place they chose. I had chosen mine. A place of dignity, even if it meant walking alone for a while. When I got home, I found my daughter waiting for me. She seemed nervous. "I've thought about this a lot," she said. "And I want you to know that I won't make any more decisions about your life without you." That simple sentence carried enormous weight. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged a boundary. I nodded, feeling a tightness in my chest. It was an important step, albeit a late one. That night, my son-in-law didn't show up for dinner. He didn't ask anything. He didn't send any messages. His silence was different from mine. It was empty, resentful. I didn't feel guilty. Everyone deals with the consequences of their decisions in their own way. I had already dealt with mine for far too long. Before falling asleep, I sat on the bed and thought about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the abandonment, the imposed silence. Now I was there, whole, conscious, about to close a chapter. The ending wouldn't be perfect. Perhaps it wouldn't be final. But it would be fair. Because for the first time, I was no longer trying to save my family's image at the cost of my dignity. I closed my eyes, certain that the next day definitive decisions would be made. Clear conversations. Established boundaries. I didn't know if there would be a complete reconciliation or a necessary separation. But I knew that whatever path I chose from then on would be taken with honesty. And that, for me, was justice enough. The morning began differently. There was no rush, nor that weight in my chest that usually accompanied me upon waking. The sun filtered softly through the window, illuminating the room as if announcing the end. Not of everything, but of a cycle that had lasted longer than it should have. I sat on the bed for a few minutes, breathing deeply, aware that this day would mark a definitive turning point in my life. I got up slowly and made coffee. Every simple gesture took on a new meaning. I was no longer the woman who walked on eggshells, trying not to bother anyone, trying not to expose herself too much. I was someone who finally understood that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. While the water was boiling, I heard footsteps in the house. My daughter appeared in the kitchen, her face serious but serene. She sat down at the table without saying a word. That silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary. "She's coming to talk today," she said after a few seconds. I nodded. I expected it. I didn't feel afraid. I felt clarity. I simply replied that I would be willing to listen, but that I wouldn't compromise. She agreed. She didn't argue. That in itself showed how much things had changed. The rest of the morning passed slowly. I organized my things, tidied up documents, clothes, and mementos. I didn't know exactly what the practical outcome of that conversation would be, but I was prepared for any decision. For the first time, I wasn't dependent on anyone's approval to move forward. If I needed to leave, I would leave. If I could stay, I would stay under new conditions. The decision was mine. When my son-in-law arrived, the atmosphere was tense but restrained. We sat in the living room. He seemed tired, perhaps from a sleepless night, perhaps from the weight of his own actions. He began by talking about mistakes, misunderstandings, and external pressures. I listened in silence as always. But now, the silence wasn't submission. It was control. When he finished, I spoke. I said I would no longer accept disrespect, whether direct or subtle. I said I would not accept decisions about my life without my consent. I said I would no longer tolerate contemptuous looks, hurtful words, or attempts to belittle me. My voice didn't tremble. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply spoke with the firmness of someone who has already lost too much to give in any longer. He tried to argue, but my daughter interrupted him. For the first time, she clearly sided with me. She said she recognized her mistakes, that she now understood how much she had distanced herself from me to maintain an unbalanced relationship. She didn't ask me to forget the past. She only asked for the chance to rebuild something new, fairer, more honest. I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. I explained that forgiveness doesn't erase scars, but it can open new paths. That I was willing to move on, but not as before. Not as the invisible woman, tolerant of everything. If we were going to continue as a family, it would be with genuine respect. Otherwise, I would choose distance without guilt. My son-in-law remained silent. Perhaps understanding, perhaps simply accepting that I had lost control. The conversation ended without hugs, without exaggerated promises. But it ended with clear agreements. Defined boundaries. Truth spoken. When she left, I felt a profound weariness, but also a relief I hadn't felt in years. My daughter came over and took my hand. She didn't say anything. It wasn't necessary. Sometimes recognition comes without words. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone. I observed the people, the trees, the sky. Everything seemed the same, but I knew it wasn't. Something inside me had rearranged itself. The injustice that had marked me for so long wouldn't be forgotten, but it would no longer define me. I survived it. I learned from it. And now, I was free to write the next chapters of my life with more truth. That same day, I decided to put into action some plans I had always postponed. To go back to studying something I enjoyed, to reorganize my finances, and to reconnect with people I had lost touch with. It wasn't an immediate revolution, but it was a concrete new beginning. Each small decision reinforced my certainty that I no longer needed to live on the margins of my own story. That night, I sat down with my notebook again. This time, I didn't write about the pain. I wrote about the lessons learned. About how silence can be a powerful weapon when used wisely. About how justice doesn't always come in the form of apologies, but in the ability to say enough and move on without feeling guilty. Before going to sleep, my daughter came to my room. She said she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would still be adjustments, conflicts, and challenges. But she promised not to repeat the same mistakes. I listened carefully and told her that time would tell. Trust is rebuilt with actions, not words. She agreed and left, leaving the door ajar. I went to bed with a peaceful heart. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I was at peace with myself. The woman who had once been humiliated, silenced, and discarded now stood tall with dignity. The justice I had so longed for didn't come from outside. It was born silently, within me, the moment I decided to accept no less than I deserved. And so, with serenity and firmness, I closed that chapter of my life, not as a victim, but as the protagonist of my own new beginning.